Hi everyone, my name is Maebh Harding and I teach law at the University of Portsmouth. And we've heard a lot about words tonight. Lawyers, we love words. We're obsessed with them. We like to write them down and put them into an elaborate filing system. And the reason we do this is because when you make rules to govern a society, the detail is important. And it's also important to remember what's in the laws that you have passed. And you'll see how vital this is when we explore a pressing and up-to-date and contemporary area of law, which is the rules regulating which of your relatives you're allowed to marry. Now you laugh, but recently I've discovered that in Ireland we lost some of these rules and we've only recently figured out what they are. And this means that about 500 years of marriage in Ireland is potentially invalid. And it's led to a lot of very awkward dinner conversations. So what you have to remember about the rules governing which of your relatives you can and can't marry is they all date back to the personal life of one of our favourite monarchs, King Henry VIII. Now you know King Henry, great fan of marriage. He had 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Think how many bank holidays were involved in that. Anyway, King Henry was the first monarch to write down the rules who you could and could not marry. And most of these rules are based on Henry's personal experience of dating. So, Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, I don't know if you've been watching the Tudors, but you'll probably be up to date on this. Catherine of Aragon, she was actually his brother's wife. She was a sort of family hand-me-down. I understand that this happens in larger families. So Henry was married to her. She was considerably older than him. And after a number of years, they didn't have any sons. So he was thinking, how can I get out of this? And history records that he got a divorce and caused something called the Reformation. But we're not going to concentrate on that bit. But what he actually did was not get a divorce, but get something called an annulment, which is something favoured by celebrities like Britney Spears. It basically means that instead of saying, we got married and it didn't work out, you say, there was something wrong with the marriage and it just never happened. So Henry thinks to himself and he comes up with an act called the First Succession Act, which outlines to the people the relatives that you can and cannot marry. So it's basically like a public service announcement. And the First Succession Act goes something like this. I've been reading the Bible. And it turns out you can't marry your relatives. And this seems to include your sister-in-law. Whoops. So just for future reference, you are not permitted to marry your relatives and you are not permitted to marry your in-laws. P.S. My daughter Mary is a bastard. That's pretty much the content of the First Succession Act. So Henry goes off and he marries Anne Boleyn. This does not work out well. So it doesn't work out well, he has no male heir, so he decides to behead Anne Boleyn for adultery. But he's not really satisfied with that. King of the denial that he is, he decides, I'm going to go for another annulment. What can I do here? So he thinks back to his experience. He's previously slept with Anne's sister. Cue the Second Succession Act. It goes something like this. Dear people, I've been reading the Bible again. It turns out you can't marry your relatives, you can't marry your in-laws, and you can't marry the relatives and in-laws of anyone you've ever slept with. This is quite a big category for some people. Now, I don't know if you have that conversation with your spouse before you get married, but maybe you should. This is the Second Succession Act. It became the law in England. Now, at that stage in the 1530s, Ireland had a different system. So in order for the English laws to be passed in Ireland, which was part of your sort of colonial empire at the time, they had to go to Ireland to be passed in the Irish Parliament. In the 1530s, Ireland was a very difficult place to have a parliament. We were in a state of civil war. So this great multitasker called Lord Leonard Grey was put in charge of this. So what he did was he basically rode around Ireland with a mobile parliament. So with one hand, he fought rebels. Then he signed acts into force. And he did all of this holding an umbrella because it rained incessantly. There was an added complication. In 1530, there was no texting, there was no Twitter. News took quite a long time to get to Ireland. You had to put a man on a boat to Dublin. He had to arrive to go, where is Lord Leonard Grey? He had to ride around Ireland to the mobile parliament. He had to take Lord Leonard Grey's umbrella and then tell him the news of what had happened. So we were a bit behind the times when it came to the First and Second Succession Act. We only got round to passing the First Succession Act, which, bear in mind, says Anne Boleyn is the real queen, on the eve of the royal wedding to Jane Seymour. A tad awkward. So after the bank holiday weekend, we sheepishly passed the Second Succession Act, which says you can't marry your relatives, you can't marry your in-laws, and you can't marry the relatives and in-laws of anyone you've ever slept with. Phew, up to date, brilliant. These acts remained in force in England up until 1949, when they were repealed. Just for your notice, you can now pretty much marry anybody except your sister, your mother, or your daughter. Very liberal. In Ireland, we didn't really repeal the act, we just kind of lost it. And we only found it the other day in 2007. And to be fair to us, right, we didn't actually have a statute book which would really write down all these acts in until 1576. So it was actually too damp in Ireland for printers to survive. This is true. We tried to import a few from England, but they died of TB before they could set up the printing press. Anyway, we still had the statute rolls, and you saw one of those kind of rolls earlier. These were longer, 20 metres in fact. So we kept those in a castle, but we sort of forgot about them because they were long. There were loads of them. We weren't taking too kindly to English rules anyway. So we sort of forgot what the law was. Everybody started marrying their in-laws. Queen Elizabeth came to the throne and she said, right, we'll sort this out. Send a selection of your laws to England and we'll write them down in a book and then you'll know what the laws are and that will be great. So the powers that be in Ireland were like, maybe we shouldn't send her this one that says she's a bastard. That seems ungrateful and impolite. So the Second Succession Act remained the law in Ireland but didn't make it onto the statute book. And that statute book in 1576 is the basis of every single statute book of Irish law there has ever been. And I know because I read them all. So I'm like that. We have the law still in force, no record of it. So the law in Ireland still is, at this point, you can't marry your relatives, you can't marry your in-laws, and you can't marry the relatives and in-laws of anyone you've ever slept with. Quite a large category. It's a small country. Don't let the Catholicism fool you. Now, in fairness, we did try to sort out a statute book in the 19th century, and a guy called H.M.F. Berry sat down and worked his way systematically through the scrolls from the 1900 back. In the middle of this, in 1922, we had a few problems in Ireland, sort of a civil war type situation again, and Republican dissidents set up a bomb-making factory in the room in which we kept all of these statute rolls. Now, I think we can guess what happened. Right, it exploded, and all the statute rolls were destroyed, except one. The one that says, you cannot marry your relatives, you cannot marry your in-laws, and you cannot marry the relatives and in-laws of anyone you've ever slept with. So anyway, it settles there. Eventually, we finish sorting out the statute book. And in 2007, the Irish government, in its wisdom, decides to put the Second Succession Act back on the statute book. They didn't actually read it. They're like, this is just an old piece of law. We never repealed it. It must still be in force. Everyone had forgotten about it. I read it. It's 20 metres long, so I had to go to the archives and make an academic learned face for 20 metres of scroll until the archivists left me alone. And I looked at this and I said, okay, we kind of knew about the not marrying your relatives bit. We're not savages. And not marrying your in-laws, nobody really wants to do that anyway. But this not marrying your relatives and in-laws, anyone you've ever slept with, that's a bit radical. Don't people know about this? And of course, this has modern implications in modern Ireland. Do you want a quick divorce? Do you want to not have to pay your ex-spouse anything? You just allege that you slept with your mother-in-law the night before the wedding, and you walk away. It never happened. So I said, oh, this is kind of shocking. 500 years of marriage is potentially, invalid. Land holding potentially incorrect. So I wrote an article about it. It's published in volume 32 of Legal Studies. I'm sure you all read it. And I was expecting a legislative response, you know, from the Irish government or maybe the statute makers or whatever. Instead, I got some emails from the men of Ireland. One of them started off, "Dear Dr. Harding, I read your recent article in volume 32 of Legal Studies." Fantastic. "The night before my wedding, I slept with my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. And now I'm slightly worried about the legal validity of my marriage." And I wrote back kind of going, "I think you have bigger problems." But it's also fantastic that I can now assemble a special edition of Jeremy Kyle, which I like to call Jeremy Kyle Tudor style. So thank you very much, everyone.